Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television and in books. And this is the first of probably 5 videos, because I'm going to try and do one for each one of the scenes in the prologue for Reaper's Gale. And ordinarily I wouldn't do quite so many, but this prologue is divided up into these 5 separate scenes. There's something happening in each one that I think is actually worth talking about in terms of what Erikson is doing in the opening of this book, and I wanted to go into it. And instead of having like a really long video, I thought, we could do a couple of much shorter videos. So this is the first scene from the prologue of Reaper's Gale, book 7 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. In a landscape torn with grief, the carcasses of 6 dragons lay strewn in a ragged row, reaching 1,000 or more paces across the plain. Flesh split apart, broken bones jutting, jaws gaping and eyes brittle dry. So just pausing after this very first sentence, the opening sentence of the book. The typical way of introducing a scene is to give you a place, to give you a setting, and it's one of the standard openings. And here the setting's actually quite ephemeral. It's just a landscape. We don't know what sort of landscape, we don't know where this is, we don't know anything about that, but we get a real sense of tone, and we get a real sense of what it is we are meant to be feeling. Because while the landscape is torn with grief, just think about that for a second, because it's not a natural landscape. This landscape has been torn. It has been disrupted violently. So we know that whatever type of landscape this is, there has been this violence done upon it. And that is then emphasized by the carcasses of 6 dragons. So not even the corpses. Carcasses is much more objectified. It's much more, they are dead animals. They're not even people. Whereas we know the Alliant, these dragons in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, are sentient. But here they've just been reduced to the slabs of meat that make us all up. And in addition to that, we have, it's a ragged row. Their flesh is split apart. Their bones have been broken and are jutting out of them. Their jaws are gaping, so that sort of lifeless look, and their eyes are brittle dry. So that it's not that glassy-eyed look of a corpse lying there. It's brittle dry. They've been lying and become desiccated. All of the fluids leaked out. It's this wonderful way of getting across that absolute state of no life, of this true death that you can see in their eyes without using any of the cliches about the dead staring eyes. But what's interesting is brittle obviously gets across that sense of febrile, of something that could be easily broken. The fact that the broken bones are jutting, so again emphasizing this violence, and that the flesh has been split apart. These are not natural deaths, these are very violent deaths. And that ties into this whole aspect of the landscape being torn, again emphasizing that violence, and that the row, how they are laid out, is ragged. So again, a sense of violence and a sense of disruption. But throughout all of this is the landscape has been torn with grief. While all of this language is quite violent, quite visceral, the underlying thing here is this is the aftermath. This is the devastating aftermath of death, of battle, of all of these things happening, because it is a landscape torn with grief, sorrow, pain, suffering. That is what is actually underlying all of this. And it's a subtle emphasis that quite often in epic fantasy, we see these grand battles, we see heroes doing battle and these violent conflicts. But one of the things that underlies a lot of the Malazan Book of the Fallen is the aftermath of the battle, the cost of the battle, the cost of war, the cost of this violence, the fact that There are victims, and that is something that underlies everything. Even with all of the great battle sequences and the huge amounts of action, Erikson doesn't lose sight of the cost of it, the pain of it, what results from it. So that, I think, is a very interesting little thing at the very beginning, and it's done so simply with in a landscape torn with grief. Just by adding in that word grief, that is something that is being woven into the subtext of everything. Where their blood had spilled out onto the ground, wraiths had gathered like flies to sap and were now ensnared. So, if you recall Jurassic Park, the mosquito landing on the tree and the sap dripping down and the sap encasing it and then becoming hardened into amber. This is what's happening here, but on a supernatural level, that these wraiths, these ghosts, have been attracted to the dragon blood. We know that Elient dragons have powerful magic. Their essence is powerful. Their souls are powerful. We know that blood carries major power in the Malazan universe. Life and death through blood is so powerful and is magically rich. And these ghosts, these wraiths, so again, emphasizing the dead, the aftermath of something. But these wraiths have been attracted to it and have become stuck in it like flies to sap. They've become ensnared. And then we have the ghosts writhing and voicing hollow cries of despair as the blood darkened, fusing with the lifeless soil. So, again, just by adding in that little tiny descriptor for lifeless soil, we get a real sense of all of this death, all of this suffering, everything being built on. It's not about just direct statement of this is what happened. There's a whole load of dead dragons just lying here. It's about using these little words here and there to add to the description, and they tonally match. The subject of them matches, and they create this subtext that gives us this feeling, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. So if you think in the first line, we had that torn with grief. Now we have hollow cries of despair. We have lifeless soil. And we have the fact that they are being ensnared. They're being trapped. So this is about the aftermath of a battle and how even after a battle, you still have victims, because these ghosts, the dead, the people that may have fallen in battle, even now, instead of moving on to a different plane, one of the different metaphysical realms, they are being trapped in this world by this hardening dragon blood. And when at last the substance grew indurate, hardening into glassy stone, those ghosts were doomed to an eternity trapped within that murky prison. And what we have here, if you think back to when Seren Pedak was touching the crystalline structures, almost like that smoky quartz, and she could feel the ghosts within it, the spirits within it, the consciousnesses within it. Even if this is not exactly that thing, this is of a type. We are getting a sense that this is exactly what happened, that crystal that she touched, that mineral, was actually hardened dragon blood. And in it, trapped in it as a prison, were these wraiths, were these ghosts. These, in that instance, it was the survivor, or the dead Teist Andi from the betrayal by the Teist Idur, and who had been killed also by Kachin Chamal. But here we have a sort of shift, a change. Because while this has set all of this up in the opening paragraph, and it set that tone, the naked creature that traversed the rough path formed by the fallen dragons was a match to their mass. So while we don't know a lot about this, we know naked creature, so not really human, not really The naked creature that traversed the rough path formed by the fallen dragons was a match to their mass, yet bound to the earth, and it walked on two bowed legs, the thighs thick as 1,000-year-old trees. So this is quite a tonal shift from that opening paragraph. We've shifted focus, and we're now getting a sense of where the perspective of this section is coming from. But what's interesting here is the dragons are referred to as carcasses. So they have been devalued. And here we have a naked creature. So not a naked human, not a naked person, a naked creature. And it's referred to as it. It walked on two bowed legs. Not he, not she, it. So it's very depersonalized. And we get a sense that this naked creature that is walking along between these fallen dragons, and now that's actually quite a slightly more sympathetic view than carcasses, but was a match to their mass. So we think of how huge, how large, how powerful these dragons are. And here is something that shares that size, that scale, that bulk, but bound to the earth. Where dragons are of the air, this creature is bound to the earth. And it walked on two bowed legs, the thighs thick as 1,000-year-old trees. So the size, the scale, the solidity, the strength, by connecting this to the earth, by using 1,000-year-old trees, this thickness, the thighs thick as 1,000, that TH sound being repeated there, gives a sense of that solidity. And again, one of the little techniques you can do is that when you look at descriptions like this, think of other ways that an author could describe the thing. Think of a different way of describing how thick someone's thighs are, and the different comparisons you make, and then put that into the sentence to see if the sentence has the same sense, if something changes about it. And when you do that, you realize authors very deliberately, at least some of the time, deliberately pick language for a reason, not just for the superficial, I'm telling you what's happening, but to create a resonance, to create an effect beyond the simple telling of information. And that is one of the things I think needs emphasized again and again, is that there are reasons for that word being chosen. The width of its shoulders was equal to the length of a Parthenotoblakai's height. So again, this size is being emphasized. And when we think of the Toblakai, when we think of how powerful they are, that connotation is being added in. So it's not just size, it's also strength and power being added to this, because we've had comparisons to dragons, the most powerful things that we know of in the universe. Their thighs being as thick as 1,000-year-old trees, the sheer staggering size and scale of that their shoulders were the length of a Toblakai's height, Karsa's height. And when we think, because of that direct connection, we think of Karsa's strength is added in as this subtle connotation. From a thick neck hidden beneath a mane of glossy black hair, the frontal portion of the head was thrust forward. So again, the thickness of the neck hidden beneath a mane of, and this is a surprising descriptor here, glossy black hair. So in all of this stuff so far, we've had darkness, we've had the shades being attracted to the dragon blood that's hardening, the destruction of the landscape. But here, glossy is very healthy, where you'd almost assume dank, greasy, something like that. But this is actually healthy. This is something that is attractive. And yet that doesn't, it almost seems like a contradiction. It seems wrong for that kind of image. And it's this sort of way of subtly undercutting the expectation that this creature because they have been described as a creature, is monstrous. There's this conflict between those two different points. But the frontal portion of the head was thrust forward. So we have this idea of the protruding brow ridge, but thrust forward, again, aggressive, emphasizing power. Brow, cheekbones, and jaw, and its deep-set eyes revealing black pupils surrounded in opalescent white. So again, this deep-set eyes, these eyes that are set so far back, but they are black pupils, which again, we associate with that very inhuman, monstrous, dark, evil. All of those sorts of connotations immediately spring to mind, and yet are undercut by opalescent white. Because opalescent is a positive description of white. It's something precious. It is something glowing. It is something beautiful. And it just seems that slight contrast. So the glossy black hair and the opalescent white sort of give lie to this physical impression we are getting of this creature that seems monstrous. It seems disproportionate, but we're subtly being told there's more to it than that. The huge arms were disproportionately long, the enormous hands almost scraping the ground. Its breasts were large, pendulous, and pale as it strode past the battered, rotting carcasses. The motion of its gait was strangely fluid, not at all lumbering, and each limb was revealed to possess extra joints. So there's a lot to unpack in this little section, because first of all, extra joints, we are immediately thinking of the the Forcalasail. The Forcalasail that we saw in House of Chains had those strange additional joints on their body, but they were described as quite scrawny, that they weren't large. This creature is somehow different, is much more solid, much bigger than that, but possesses that very strange quality that the Forcalasail had, which is these extra joints. And they're the only ones that's really been mentioned about. So that is a point of connection that we're picking up on. But we also get a sense that this creature is female in some way because of the emphasis on breasts. But so much of that is the huge arms were disproportionately long, the enormous hands almost scraping the ground. This seems like one of those primordial creatures. We've seen something like the Erisal, these ancient creatures from a time before humans, from a time that aren't civilized like the Teast. That this is something different, something more ancient, something more bestial, something more primordial. And it strode past. So it didn't just walk, like it traversed the rough path earlier, but now it is striding, these long, powerful walking motion, moving towards things with purpose. And then we're told the motion of its gait was strangely fluid, not at all lumbering. So again, this constant undercutting of our expectation about what a big, powerful, ancient, bestial creature is going to move like. This creature is actually moving with a delicate grace. They are fluidly moving through the landscape. And that seems, again, at odds with this picture that we're creating in our mind. Skin the hue of sun-bleached bone, darkening to veined red at the ends of the creature's arms, bruises surrounding the knuckles, a latticework of cracked flesh exposing the bone here and there. The hands had seen damage, the result of delivering devastating blows. So again, tying back into that image that we had of the Forcalasail and their not beautiful alabaster skin, their strange pale colorlessness, that they were pallid, that they had this unnatural whiteness to their skin. And here it is here, sun-bleached bone, that very stark white, lacking any sense of life to it. And again, bleached bone, we're getting a sense, tying back into all of the other imagery and all of the other tonal aspects that we have here of death being associated with this character. Darkening to veined red. So using, obviously veins, we would assume, the sort of blue color, that's what veins are. But veined red, this idea of blood, which is in the context, in the tone, a suggestion of violence here, not just a wound, but violence. Bruises surrounding the knuckles. So again, the suggestion of violence, and it's the only bruises, the only real color apart from the red at the end of the creature's arms, bruises surrounding the knuckles, so violent damage. A lattice work of cracked flesh exposing the bone here and there. This damage done to the dragons, we see there's damage to this character as well. And they don't seem to be cradling their hands or worried about it. There is a level of violence and pain here. If you think their knuckles cracked, exposing the bone, and yet they're walking fluidly through this landscape. And then we find out that this damage was the result of delivering devastating blows. So there is a strong sense here that this creature is the thing that killed the dragons. Or, if not the dragons, has been killing a lot of very powerful things. It paused to tilt its head upward and watched as the three dragons sailed the air high amidst the roiling clouds, appearing then disappearing in the smoke of the dying realm. So when you move through this entire section, if you are aware of that language of violence, that language of death, you start to pick up on the fact that it's woven through all of these different descriptions, even in different parts of it. So you get this overall impression being added up. But what's interesting here is, again, even though we're starting to get more aspects of what this character is and what they're doing, it is still referred to as an it. We've been told that it has breasts, but there's no femaleness being assigned to this character, which is slightly curious. Then we have this moment where this character looks up at these three dragons that are essentially escaping because the earthbound creature's hands twitched and a low growl emerged from deep in its throat. Again, emphasizing this bestial, violent nature, but earthbound contrasting with the dragons flying through the air. Beyond the last of the dead dragons, to a place where rose a ridge of hills, the largest of these cleft through as if a giant claw had gouged out the heart of the rise. And in that crevasse raged a rent, a tear in space that bled power in nacreous streams. A lot in this sentence, because that's just one sentence. So beyond the last of the dead dragons, so again, emphasizing the death all around, to a place where rose a ridge of hills. So we know it's plains. We know these plains have been torn with grief. And now in the distance, just past this line of dragons that we've been walking along with this creature, there's a ridge of hills. So it's not a featureless plain, but we're getting a sense, a better sense now, although nebulous, of the landscape. The largest of these cleft through as if a giant claw had gouged out the heart of the rise. So think of this language here. On the one hand, describing, oh, there's a big chunk missing out of this hill. Big deal. But then look at the language that actually describes that. Giant claw had gouged out the heart. And you tie that back in to what we are discussing here. A big creature with damaged hands surrounded by dragon corpses. And we get a giant claw had gouged out the heart. So although that description is obviously being applied as a simile to describe the shape of the hill and the chunk missing out of the hill and that sort of tearing up of the landscape, that language works so well with the subtext of what's going on with the creature. And then we're told, in that crevasse raged a rent. So raged a rent, a personification of this tear in space and time. We've seen these rents before. We've seen that these are tears between the different layers and levels of the realities and the metaphysical places and the warrens. And we know that this is bad. We know that this is not good. But it bled power in nacreous streams. So this sense of power, but tied into devastation, tied into destruction. The malice of that energy was evident in the manner in which it devoured the sides of the fissure, eating like acid into the rocks and boulders of the ancient berm. And again, this using the different language now to get another sense of destruction, another sense of this process that is violently destroying the world, eating like acid into the rocks. This is not a, slow erosion over time. This is violent. This is destructive. The rent would soon close, and the one who had last passed through had sought to seal the gate behind him. But such healing could never be done in haste, and this wound bled anew. And this is fascinating because now there's an element of mystery being dropped in. The rent was going to close, so it is closing. It is on its way out. It is being healed. And then we think of the cleft that had been left as if this giant claw had come down. And we realize if the rent is in the middle of it and it's been eating into the rocks, but now it's getting smaller, we know the opening of that rent actually created this cleft in the rocks because the rent was bigger in the past. And none of that is spelled out, but it's there in the logic of what we're being told, what we're being fed in terms of the information. But there's a mystery. Who is this he? The first person identified by gender in this, that he had gone through, as if we should know who it is. Ignoring the virulence pouring from the rent, the creature strode closer. At the threshold, it paused again and turned to look back the way it had come. This rent is bleeding acid, but the energy is nacreous. So something that is potentially positive and beautiful and wonderful, but describing that sort of, again, opalescence, that nacre having the shine is of mother of pearl. And you would think that would be a very positive image, but because it's been tied into acidically eating away the land, and now it's being described as virulence pouring from the rent, we get that dual nature of power as both attractive and power as destructive. Draconian blood hardening into stone, horizontal sheets of the substance already beginning to separate from the surrounding earth, to lift up on edge, forming strange, disarticulated walls. Some then began sinking, vanishing from this realm, falling through world after world, to reappear, finally, solid and impermeable in other realms, depending on the blood's aspect. And these were laws that could not be challenged. Starvel Damalain, the blood of dragons and the death of blood. And this is where we're getting this further insight. The stuff that was suggested earlier on about the crystalline structure trapping these ghosts being something that Seren Pedek met and touched in Midnight Tides. we're getting a sense of how this could happen, that this magical blood, when it hardens into this, can fall through the different realms, can fall through different warrens, can move from Starvel Demolane, the Warren of Dragons, and end up in other realms. So there's a stronger suggestion, again, that this is tying into what Seren Pedak found. And because of that, there's then the suggestion that this is actually a further point of connection to what we saw of that conflict in the Prologue of Midnight Tides between the K'chain Chamal and the Teist, and then the betrayal of the Teist Andi by the Teist Eater. Are we in the same place, or at least adjacent to it? And once we start thinking that, because that's the point of connection that we've gotten to with Seren Pedak and the crystal contained the souls of dead Teist Andi. The Teist Andi came from that thing, and now we find out that Starvel Demolane, this is where this stuff is coming from. This sort of point of connection between all of them. Now, this did say at the beginning that this is the age of sundering, the elder warren of Curled Emerlan. So we know that this is Shadow. We know it's the age of sundering. We know it's the same time period as Midnight Tides. And now we're being told that Starvel Demolane, the blood of dragons and the death of blood, has infected part of this, part of Curled Emerlan, part of Shadow. So this is tying in to what we saw before. In the distance behind the creature, Curled Emerlan, the realm of shadows, the first realm born of the conjoining of dark and light, convulsed in its death throes. And here is our confirmation of all of this. If we had missed it in the start, if we'd missed that opening line telling us that this was meant to be Curled Emerlan, now we have confirmation in the text that it is. If we'd missed that point of connection between what happened in Midnight Tides prologue and what is happening here, again, here's our direct confirmation of that. We are in the same place. This is about the sundering, and this is about this conflict. Far away, the civil wars still raged on, whilst in other areas the fragmenting had already begun, vast section of this world's fabric torn away, disconnected and lost and abandoned, to either heal round themselves or die. And now we're getting confirmation of all of those things that we have suspected and seen fragments of in earlier books. The fragment in Raraku that Drishna used for the whirlwind was a fragment of Curled Emerlan. We know that Shadowthrone and Cotillion possess part of Curled Emerlan, but the realm itself is fragmented and there are bits and pieces of it everywhere. We see how Shadow is not a giant, continuous, contiguous place, that it is made up of these broken pieces, these polders, these small fragments here and there, and that people have been grabbing them because sometimes they either heal round themselves or they die. So they either create small pocket warrens or they disappear. So all of this is very neatly being confirmed. Things that we picked up through the text, through the various other books, we're now getting explicitly being told, yes, you were right. Yet interlopers still arrived here, like scavengers gathered round a fallen leviathan, eagerly tearing free their own private pieces of the realm, destroying each other in fierce battles over the scraps. So now we see why this is so important. Gods, beings, dragons, whatever, these interlopers, not originally from Shadow, are arriving in Shadow to claim pieces of this warren for themselves, to claim this power, and therefore they are tearing the realm apart. They're not trying to heal it. They're not trying to put it all back together. They're trying to grab pieces of it for themselves, like some sort of bizarre gold rush. And in that, they are fighting each other and causing more damage, more devastation, more conflict. And we even have that reference to civil wars, not one civil war, multiple civil wars. War is raging through the realms, brother against brother, sister against sister, race against race. There is a lot of destruction underlying all of this. And when you get lines like, this world's fabric torn away, again, think of how that violent language is underlying all of this to give you that sense. It had not been imagined by anyone that an entire realm could die in such a manner. And this is one of these great things about tone. If you think of these words, it had not been imagined by anyone that an entire realm could die in such a manner. Very factually, no one had ever imagined that a realm could die in this way. But what does that actually mean? And what it means is, yes, this realm is dying. People didn't think of it, and it has surprised them. The meaning here is actually something slightly different than what is being said. You're being told, no one's ever imagined that. You know, okay, so no one has ever imagined trees. Fair enough. And you go, no one ever imagined trees. Look at this forest. Trees exist. And it's actually a meaning about the lack of imagination, the lack of forethought, the lack of thought and intelligence and reasoning of the people of this time, that they never contemplated that you could do this. And clearly they have done it. That the vicious acts of its inhabitants could destroy everything. These people never considered the cost of their acts. And remember how at the beginning I said, one of the things to note about this is the landscape is torn by grief. That yes, we have all of this violence underlying and running through this entire description, but underlying all of it is grief and sorrow and loss, because this did not have to be. Worlds live on had been the belief, the assumption, regardless of the activities of those who dwelt upon them. Torn flesh heals, the sky clears, and something new crawls from the briny muck. This sense of optimism that no matter what we do, no matter what we engage in, the world will always recover. Now, obviously, in today's context, that is almost certainly going to be read as a direct commentary on climate change. But it goes beyond that. It goes to the fact of, we do not think of the unintended consequences of our actions. We don't generally contemplate the knock-on effects of the things that we do. And ultimately, we believe that in the end, things will work out. That's kind of, given a long enough time frame, everything's going to be fine. That's always there at the back of our mind. But here we have, no, sometimes there are fatal consequences. Sometimes there are consequences that cannot be avoided and cannot be changed, healed, revoked. We are left with a final state that cannot be fixed. And that is something that is, again, sorrowful. Here is a realm that has died, that has been torn apart, and you cannot put it back together again. No matter how hard you try, that thing is now broken. But not this time. Too many powers, too many betrayals, too vast and all-consuming the crimes. And I want to just pause on this line for a second. Too many powers, too many betrayals, too vast and all-consuming the crimes. Throughout the Malazan Book of the Fallen, we've had this sense, or this use of convergence, power drawing power, Where there's a power vacuum, people will flock into it. Where you have one powerful person acting, it'll draw another powerful person to try to take them out, and then another powerful person trying to take out whoever survives because they might be weakened. Power draws power. Convergence is literalized in this world. And now we see the consequence of that. Because if we think back to Gardens of the Moon, there was real reticence on behalf of these most powerful people to unleash their full power. We saw it in Memories of Ice, where they were genuinely worried about these powers converging in a part of the world. We keep seeing this time and time again. Why don't these powerful beings just do something? And now we have our answer. The last time powerful beings got together to do things, to directly act, to face off against each other, to fight, to contest a realm, to war amongst themselves, an entire warren got shattered. Now imagine you are one of those elders, one of those gods. The last time you had a big fight, curled Emerlan got shattered into pieces. What's going to happen this time? What realm is going to be destroyed this time? Because that is now a foreseeable consequence for your action. Beforehand, people honestly didn't think that this could happen. They thought all the realms would be fine. They'll eventually heal. Like, it'll all be great. Torn flesh heals, the sky clears, and something new crawls from the briny muck. Now they know that's not true. They can actually kill entire realms with their fights. So this allows us now, when we think of Gardens of the Moon and the earlier books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, all of those times when we thought, why aren't they acting? Why aren't the gods just doing these things? Why aren't these ascendants just doing these things? Why don't they all just fight? Why don't they all just have a big fight and all scrap together? Now we have our answer, because a lot of those characters remember what happened the last time they did that. And it caused the death of curled Emerlan. The creature faced the gate once more. Then Kilmanderos, the elder goddess, strode through. And so finally, we now know who this character is, who this god is that has been walking through these dragon corpses. And think of the rhythm of that last little section there, but not this time. Too many powers, too many betrayals, too vast and all-consuming the crimes. The creature faced the gate once more. Then Kilmanderos, the elder goddess, strode through. These short, sharp, brutal things. We've gone from long paragraphs, we've gone from long run-on sentences. These are short sentences. This is about power and movement and striding forward. And there's a certain apprehension here that this brutal creature that we've been seeing, that we know is powerful, is even more powerful than we thought, because it's Kilmanderos, the elder goddess, and she's passing through the rent. So I know that ran on a little bit longer than I'd intended, but the points of this opening, and why I think it's important, not just for Reaper's Gale, but for the Malazan Book of the Fallen in general. Each of these prologues adds to our understanding of what is going on in the meta-narrative, in the grander narrative of everything that's happening in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And we see, again, this reference to the far past and how it is connected to the present that we are viewing, because we saw that with Serenpetek and Midnight Tides and the touching of the fossilized dragon blood. That thing that we just saw the creation of has a resonance in the modern day of the narrative. So we continually get this reference to all of these ancient things that happened have an impact in the future, in the modern day, the modern setting of the novels. The past is always with us, so that's running through it. We also see this violence and conflict and death and destruction and grasping for power has been there since the beginning, and it is a continuing theme of all of these novels. That all of these ancient cultures, all of the modern cultures, everything is about violent conflict. None of these things are resolved through a couple of people sitting down and having a diplomatic chat and trying to work out a way to get along. That's not what's happening. What's happening here is, let's gank that guy. And so, again, that is being emphasized in it. What happened in the past is happening again now. So that's an important aspect, I think, to bear in mind. And then we also see this whole aspect that explains why these ascendant powers are acting through cat's paws and manipulating mortals to do their bidding and using proxies and manipulating all of these other people to do things rather than doing them directly themselves. Because once they start getting involved themselves, there's a chance for it to escalate and for the entire world or realm to be destroyed. And that makes so much more sense now. Now that we know that, we understand why their actions are the way that they are, why they manipulate mortals the way that they do, why they try to avoid direct conflicts with each other, why they're continually circling around each other instead of just walking up and punching each other and starting a fight. Because the ramifications of an escalation of power like that can lead to the destruction of the world. And they have to be pushed to it. So seeing it spelled out so starkly and seeing all of that together, it gives this wonderful retrospective look and amount of understanding about all of these things that's gone before. It's answering questions that we've had at the back of our minds. And through it all, we saw how all of that violent language is linked up and repeated and connected through the entire passage. But it's also connected to a sense of loss, a sense of grief, the aftermath of losing someone and something precious. That it's not just about the great and glorious battle. It's actually about, no, there's a cost to this. And this cost is something that is going to rend our souls, is going to rip out our hearts. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you in the next one.